Going in through chapter 12 on objections. So this chapter is pretty interesting. So he's kicking off with I think a number of interesting responses to main objections what a lot of people have to anarchist or even just communist society in general, specifically concerns about work, right? Like this is the one we always hear. This one that was very common in Kropotkin's time and clearly is still common today. Well, if everybody's provided for, then nobody's ever going to work. And he breaks up the argument into two general things, right? So he has first section of the argument in which he's objecting the possibility that individuals in and of themselves will be less productive if society was organized in a sense way. And then he goes on to argue against the freeloader objection. So he divides it up. And I think that this division is really important, right? Because I think that even in today's debate, you'll hear a lot of people lump these two arguments in together. And then whenever you attack one side of it, then they'll just pop and then, use concerns about the other. And then it just becomes a sort of, I mean, what's the name of that arcade game where you're just hitting the different ones and then the other one just pops out. Yeah, whack-a-mole. It just becomes a game of whack-a-mole when you're trying to respond to or answer these sorts of objections. And so for him to lump them together and split them up and then hit both sides of it, I think is pretty effective there. So Chris, do you have any comments on chapter 12?
Yeah, just, he did attack this idea, and I've actually heard this on my stream when I'm talking to people, and I kind of attack capitalism a little bit, and people always come back with that, well, how are people going to work if they're not earning money for their wage? And I got to say, I like a lot of the arguments that he puts forward in here, but I don't know that you're going to convince too many people who are kind of on that other side and want to stick to that capitalism is great idea. I don't know if these arguments will be convincing enough to individuals like that. I mean, one thing that I found very, very persuasive was this argument that if you were free to pursue the things that interested you, that you were passionate about, and you could find something that was still considered work, not a pastime, but the work of the 4 to 5 hours that you'd be putting in per day, if you could find something in that area that matched up with your interests, you would be much more interested in going to work and putting in that day's work because you believe in what you're doing. Right now in this capitalist system, you sort of go where you can get paid, and you might not even necessarily believe in what you're doing. And then also the conditions of the factories and the employment places themselves are oftentimes, why would you want to go there? If you're, one of the things he brought up in here was bad work for bad pay. So if these capitalists are always cutting your pay down lower and lower and lower, and you don't feel like you're being fairly compensated, you're not going to want to go to work. If you're going there and there's a factory and the factory is dark and it's loud and your hearing is getting damaged and all sorts of, you're not going to want to spend your day there. So I think he makes a good point to say that if profit is your motive, you're going to end up with workplaces that are not pleasant places to spend your day. Whereas if you let the workers decide, they're going to make those changes that make it more enjoyable to be there during the day. And there's a couple of reasons why you're less likely to see this idea of people just kind of loafing around. Plus, there would obviously be a change in culture. I mean, we already kind of have a culture where we value hard work and people who go out and work hard and that kind of stuff. I think you would still see that, especially as it became more important. I think there would be kind of this outcast mentality that if you're just seen as feeding off society, there might be some social pressures that push you to not be like that.
Well, there's a lot of questions there, which sure that get to some concerns that I was raising to you before we started our stream. But kind of, I guess, go through arguments that he gives us, because he has very specific arguments for why he thinks the things things. So at the get-go of this, at the chapter here at the beginning, it says, quote, it is not to answer the objections raised by authoritarian communism, right? So he's saying that the kind of what he has called in the book bourgeois communism, which he's conflated with Marx failure or not, that's what he's called it. And he's saying that not to us to answer those objections, and objections specifically in that because we oppose that authoritarian communism as well. And throughout this, notice if you're paying close attention while you're reading chapter 12, you'll notice that he's not just criticizing capitalism, he's criticizing Marx just as much as he's criticizing capitalism and a system of wages which he believes continues in through state communism. But going through a little bit more, that's sort of just to focus it that he is talking the anarchist approach to things. He says here, let us consider, here he says down at the bottom of what the first page from, he says, quote, let's see if a society composed of men as we are today, neither nor worse, neither more or less industrious, have a chance of successful development. I think that this is an important aspect for him to go down on. I think that a lot of people will criticize anarchism or communism as being just this idealist fantasy. They're imagining people they are not yet. The famous criticism to say that communists imagine men to be angels, right? And this is clearly not what Kropotkin has in mind here. He's saying here, no, we're angels. Let's imagine us as we are today and see if we can develop our arguments which are going to get us to an anarchist system. And then he says, of course, then he goes on to this objection. He says the objection is known. If the existence of which is guaranteed, if it is, and if the necessity of earning wages does not compel him to work, nobody will work. Every man will lay the burden of his work on another if he is not to do it himself. And he had an interesting corollary to hear later in the chapter, where he specifically points out that the ultimate motivation for people to work hard in a capitalist society is for them to get ahead, not just for themselves, future into life, but also for their children. But ultimately what that means is that their ultimate goal in working hard is so that way they don't have to work, and that their work will then be offloaded onto other people. In other words, the ultimate goal of working hard in a capitalist society, according to Kropotkin, is the maintenance of the capitalist system itself. And so he, of course, has a major problem with that, right? So his objection then is going to hinge on the badness, you might say, of the system itself. Because he's essentially saying then that the motivation for working hard in the capitalist system is not necessarily for your own benefit, but for the possibility of then in future exploiting labor forward. So that'd be difficult for him to respond to. But I think, and Chris, you'll agree with me that this is actually quite fascinating. His maneuver here. He goes here and he said the first note of incredible. Actually, let me start off the sentence. He says, first note the incredible levity with which this objection is raised, referring to the objection of, well, basically nobody's going to work, without even realize that the real question raised by this objection is merely to know, on one hand, whether you are effectively obtained by wage work the results that are said to be obtained, and on the other hand, whether voluntary work is not already now more productive than work accumulated by wages. And so I think this goes into what he says later because essentially, like we've talked about some different times throughout this series here, Kropotkin is trying to develop a science. So his view for how we can develop a rational scientific society is that we must develop a science or geology, or what he's going to refer to later down in this page, at least for me, a political economy in which, that the basis of a political economy should be the study of the most favorable conditions for giving society the greatest amount of useful products with the least waste of human energy. Mm-hmm. And so he's saying this is the definition of what the science of economics and what political economy must be. And if it's not aimed at, then it's not, like, it's essentially just a sort of it's ultimate pseudoscience, right? And he also goes on to say here, quote, whereas in exact science, such as we might say physics, chemistry, men give their opinion subjects infinitely less important and less complicated after serious research and after serious collection and analysis of the facts and data on this question, will pronounce judgments without appeal, with resting satisfied with only one particular event, such as, example, the success of some small communist association in America. And so when it to these complicated science of sociology, which I should, he's relying here on the work of, I believe Auguste Comte, who essentially argued that there's different stages development of scientific theories, putting physics versus the hallmark of science as we know it today. As we advance, we'll move into stages of psychology, into sociology. And so he's saying here that sociology is a much more complicated science than physics. That's why we haven't managed to sort of drill down on these, clear rules. And that seems reasonable. I mean, it's assumed certain things about metaphysics, but it seems like a facial plausible claim here. But he's sociology here is just so complicated, and yet people will rest content because supposedly you can't have exact answers. They'll just rest content with giving you one example. Oh, well, there you go. I don't know, Chris. I find that really, really interesting to science. I don't know. I guess I'll just leave it at that. This is a very curious approach to science. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, and before I continue, I'm getting some kind of audio distortion coming from your. I don't know. Do you have something different set up differently on your end or something? I'm getting a distortion in your audio. I don't know if. Oh, now I can't hear you at all.
It muted it. Is it better now?
I don't know. Talk for a second.
How's it going? How's it going?
I think it's still. I'm getting some crackling and stuff. I'm not sure what the.
That's good.
That's all right. All right. Anyways, we can try to figure it out. So let's see. Where were we? So yeah, I mean, I have that highlighted too. The study of the most favorable conditions for giving society the greatest amount of useful products with the least waste of human energy. And he goes back to this idea of that waste of human energy. And, somewhere in here, I forget where it was, but he talks about how we put people doing these jobs that are very tedious. I think he mentions punching the hole into a needle, some kind of a thing that you're going to sit there and do 5,000 times a day. Well, no one wants to do that kind of a job, right? And he'll say, we create this waste of human energy to put a few more dollars in the capitalist's pocket. But what is it you're taking from society in that way? I mean, you're creating people who don't want to go to work and who don't want to participate, in this job. Who would want to sit there and just pull one crank 5,000 times a day? And as we know, that's not even healthy for humans to do the same repetitive motion all day long. So there's kind of this, there's this human waste that then leads us down this wrong path, I would say, which goes to that argument of people don't want to do this kind of work. You have to make the work suitable to human beings as well, right?
Yeah, and he's an interesting gesture towards, I think, his view of science, at least the science of sociology. He says in just a few paragraphs down here, quote, "What is most striking about this is that, again, levity referring to how easily they are, how quickly it'll roll off their tongue, this object hard work. They say, what is most striking about this levity is that even in capitalist political economy, you already find a few compelled by facts to doubt the axioms put by the founders of their science. That the threat of hunger is man's stimulant for productive work," right? So he's saying that, even among capitalist economists, they're saying to question this assumption, saying, hold on, this might be the way to approach it, but people will pronounce with just a few sparse examples, he says, on this supposedly obvious objection to the point. I think that this is really interesting. Right. I think that this is actually a quite astute analysis of human behavior. It's certainly something that I think we've all maybe known, but I think that Kropotkin here actually gesturing towards solution to why that might be. Right. In a certain sense, that because of the fact this science is much more complicated, according to Kropotkin, that people think that since supposedly there can't be an exact answer, people say, well, then example must, or any answer must be acceptable. And I think that I don't know. I think that this is interesting way to think about the science of sociology. I'm not quite sure how much I agree, but it's I think a worthwhile contribution.
Yeah, I mean, sociology is just such a tricky kind of science, anyways. I mean, it's not like you follow the same tracks that you do with, say, a physics or something like that. I mean, there's, it's kind of a little bit of a muddier science, I
And
would
certainly
think.
a hundred something years ago, certainly even more.
Right. So it seems like, certainly harder to track those things down and really treat it as like a hardcore science where you definitely know, we feel strongly about this thing. I mean, it's definitely harder to track. So, yeah, kind of a difficult thing to.
Well, it's I mean, I suppose it's an open question whether or not that's because of some kind of irreducible complexity, or whether or not that's because we just haven't figured it out yet, right? Like, do the fact that we're relying on statistical method tell us something that, oh well, it's just a measure of our uncertainty, or is it ultimately just a measure of, well, even if I have all the information in a system, I still can't predict exactly what's going to go on in certain sorts of macro systems. So it's an open question, but I suppose that moving a little bit beyond some of what Kropotkin would think. I think that he would say that there are final answers to these questions, and that indeed society, like biology, according to tracks of evolution, progresses. So in any case, let's move on a little bit from that point there. Is there any main points that you all want to hit on here in part?
In part two, what are you cutting out? At part two, did you say?
In part one.
Oh, part one. I think that kind of sums it up. I don't have too much after what we already talked about. Yeah.
Okay. Actually, there is one really in part to nuts in part one. It says here, quote, moreover, who but the economists themselves taught us that while a wage earner's work is very often different and intense, intense and productive work is, quote, only obtainable man who sees his wealth in proportion to his efforts. So this is Kropotkin's response to the objection. Because again, remember, he broke up the first of the objection, basically say that the question whether or not, on the hand, voluntary work could possibly be productive than property when it is owned by individuals. And so, in a certain sense, he's saying that like he might even think that like sort of the sense of economics can't tell you whether or not property is more productive than sort of voluntary, communally owned property, because it's only assessing on the basis of private property, right? Like it's Bell models based on private property and trying to maximize along the lines of capital. But he's saying that that's what science of political economy must do. And so his claim here is productivity only obtained when a man sees his wealth increase in proportion to its efforts. So of course, this goes into some of the stuff that he talks about later about sort of shoddy pay for go canny, I believe what he called it, but that well, you give me an order really hard. I know I shouldn't know that, because if I work really hard, then that's just going to be the standard, and I am not going to get paid anymore, because right, like if I come into it every single day giving 100, that means suddenly that's going to be the minimum. Giving 100. So if I give 80, then that's going to be the bare minimum. And so there's no incentive, according to Kropotkin, in the private property to give it your all. And not only that, or excuse me, it isn't there is no incentive to give it your all, because it's going to be taken away from you. And so work, your output doesn't, in your benefit for yourself, your well-being doesn't improve in proportion to the effort you're putting into it. A capitalist system. So that's his objection to the lazy person argument.
Yeah, I think there's some validity there, that right now most of us do work that is so disconnected from results that we're able to see. You just go somewhere, you perform some function, probably not very rewarding. Like, he mentions a number of tedious tasks where it's not even like you get to make a whole project and then at the end of the day feel good about your project. It's like he was saying, just this repetitive punching holes in needles or whatever. You take the that feeling of accomplishment and being proud about something, you take that out of the action, then of course people are not going to be very excited about doing their work, and you don't give them the creativity to change their work environment to better suit them, to make the day more enjoyable, to maybe be creative with stuff a little bit or find new ways to, if everyone in the factory was sitting there and trying to find new ways to make it run a little bit more efficient so they could work a little less for the same amount of stuff, then people would do that. But what do you care if coming up with new efficiencies just means the guy at the top makes a little more money and you're not going to see any of that anyways? Then you're going to be totally disconnected from any of that, and you're not going to feel real great about being at work.
Right, and he even says so much. He says here, quote, by admitting that the only guarantee to be robbed of the fruits of our labor is to possess the instruments of our labor. And so if we ultimately own our labor and own our production, own the means of production, have control over it, then the surface there is just going to get taken off. It's going to get shaved off the top, and we don't get to see it. So as a result, our well-being doesn't improve in proportion to the input that we put in, right? He's saying that, I suppose, in a system, in a system I'm controlling things, the harder I work, the more I put in, the more that I should get out. But he's saying that that's not the way this system works, and so it isn't going to be more efficient. Right.
And so, I think I think that's one of the things I was talking about. That's a hard case to make to someone who isn't already like open-minded to this kind of stuff. But I think if you come in open-minded, I think that's a reasonable argument. But I think to a lot of people, the idea of having say in your own workplace is so foreign that it's like, oh, well, that's a fantasy. That's a kind of a dream world that you're living in. But I think there's validity to it, right? This is like one of the things he talks about, pastime, and you chase your passions in your pastime. That's one of the things people like, is whatever you're working on in your pastime, you get to be creative with it. You get to do it how you think it should be done. You have say, and then when there's an outcome, you get to feel proud of the thing that you accomplished, which for most people, all that is completely missing in the modern workplace.
Right, and he seems to think that we need to do these things together. Like, you should be able to choose when you do this part of the task, when you do that other part of the task, and that when you can sort of have that freedom and have that choice, your being is gonna increase. I think you're right. This is a little bit of a thought experiment that isn't quite connected to perhaps the sort of psychological, reasons why people are objecting to the communist system, like this lazy person argument. And I don't know, Chris, about you, but I've found that it's really important sometimes to speak to the real reasons why someone is objecting something. Now, this can be difficult. It's not always clear. They're going to tell you why they're actually objecting to something, right? Like one of smart people are particularly good at making up reasons that are not the actual reasons for objecting to things. Right. And so you hit all their argument they give you, even if you gently knock it down, it's a real reason why. And so it can become really difficult to respond to things. And I think that this is an example here where, you might have an interesting argument. I mean, I suppose that there are empirical components they need to be tested, but I'm not sure the actual person, like the reason why they're objecting to the communist system is because of the fact that production is going to go down in net. Like, I don't think that that's all why people actually object to it. I think that that's something that people say. It seems to be a kind of like, well, I don't like that they're getting something, and think that they're going to be working at least harder than the average person or something along that line. It seems to be a much more visceral objection from those who do level that objection, as opposed to this intellectual objection which Ken is responding to.
And he makes a note in here somewhere. I can't remember exactly where he makes this quote. Here it is. So, to avoid a possible evil, you have recourse to means which in themselves are a greater evil. So I guess this is kind of what I think about it. This, in reality, the amount of problem that would occur from people being lazy and not working, I think is very, very small, right? And so I think it's like we have people objecting to this entire system because of something that may be like probably less than 1% of the population are going to be the issue, right? So we throw this whole concept out over what I think is a very, very tiny problem.
Well, okay, so yes, that's a different argument than the one we were just responding to, because as we mentioned at the beginning, he is splitting up the two arguments. Where's where he responds specific to that objection?
About 5 paragraphs into number 3.
5 paragraphs into number 3. Yeah, he basically says this our opponents agree to, but the danger, say, will come from a minority of loafers who will not work and who will not have regular habits in spite of the excellent condition which would make their work pleasant. Going on in the quote of lines down, he says, but one black sheep suffices to contaminate a whole flock. This is sort of him quoting what other people would say. And then later down in the paragraph, he says, this we believe is the objection fairly stated. And this is also lumps into a concern about the state. He says that the law courts and all their things must supposedly, according to the authoritarian, arise for this concern, that we'll get worried about there being a few people, and so then we have the law court. That's always used as, and I see this even today. People use an argument for the law court, for the police system, right? There's lazy people, there's people who won't work, there's those who indolence, and people who won't follow the regular habits, as it says Kropotkin. But he basically says. In response to the quote down paragraphs, to avoid this possible evil, you have recourse to means which in themselves are great evil and become those same abuses that you will remedy. So I mean, this is sort of an allusion to something is sort of I suppose very topical to much of the political discourse today, where there's concern about police officers, and there's right. concern that actually when you go into the communities and oppress these communities, you actually end up making it worse, create more of the cycles of violence which you seek to remedy. And I will say this is an interesting observation, which I've there's revenge stories, Chris, throughout the beginning of Western literature. I mean, Homer's Odyssey and the Iliad is essentially that, right? Like a story about how revenge cycles just sort of repeat themselves, and that needs someone to come just stop, right? That's why the play is it a play? I don't know. No, it's a poem. How it ends with actually like a Deus ex machina, right? Like a god has to come down and then all kind of forgiveness to stop from creating another cycle of violence when the king comes home to attacks all the suitors, right? And that's the only way to actually stop a cycle of violence. You can't respond retribution, according to Homer, if right. you want to have if you want to continue to have a basically like a good society. Now, I'm not a literary critic or expert, but I will say this is a very common theme throughout literature. Actually, I will say if any of you played The Last of Us Part 2, it's definitely modeled after Homer's after parts of Homer, and it has a similar theme, similar message that you just need to at some point put in the framing of The Last of Us, put the guitar down at some point, and basically say, you know what, I'm not going to change. And that's the only way actually to find peace and find fulfillment, because otherwise just the violence is going to continue. Violence is going to continue. And Kropotkin seems to have a grasp on this idea that ultimately, if we want these abuses to stop, well, then we can't just respond by furthering these abuses more. Right. I suppose though, it is possible to say that this is a literary response as opposed to kind of empirical response. There might be reason to think that you could develop some kind of scientific experiment to test when it might be appropriate to respond with a contribution and when not. Right? There might be a little bit more nuance than literary artists might want to always suppose. But certainly, I think that he's on something there. Am I off in saying that?
No, I think that's actually as far as the literary point, I think that's a very interesting point that you make. I hadn't really thought of it from that perspective of the literary angle, but I think that's a good one. I think it definitely kind of shows, you can't just you're not going to get to this point by sort of half measuring with capitalism. You're going to have something come in and sort of change the system itself, which seems to be and I've mentioned this a couple times, it seems, Kropotkin seems to be very like an absolutist individual. Like, if something can be corrupted, it's got to go. You have to sort of get rid of it completely, because even if you left some remnants of wages inside the system, you're just going to end up back with capitalism again, right? It's just all going to come back this direction.
Right. And he says so much. It's his ultimate response to what he's calling bourgeois communism, or the sort of state communism. He says at the very start of part 3 for this chapter 12, he says they recognize that paid with money in under the name of labor checks to workers' associations governed by the state would keep up the characteristics of wagedom and retain all of its disadvantages. So the idea being that well, you tried to substitute pay or substitute wages for a kind of labor check. Okay, well, you're given, say, 4 hours for working today. You can have perhaps a ratio of doctors, maybe get a little bit more. The simple complex distinction, which Kropotkin has criticized earlier in the book, right? That ultimately, if you do this, you haven't knocked down the wage system entirely, and so you're going to still have that incentive to exploit. Again, going back to that quote earlier, the entire incentive in a capitalist society, Kropotkin is arguing, is essentially that one day you won't have to work, or that your children won't have to work. Essentially, what would mean for their children to have a better life, that then they would be relying on the labor of others and sort of sit back and enjoy their luxury on the back of other people. But this means that ultimately the incentive to work hard in a capitalist society is that capitalism would continue, Kropotkin seems to think. And I think that's a brilliant response. I don't know, like, I suppose that there are like empirical questions mixed in here, right? Like, it seems like some of this stuff you might be able to test, and you might be able to sort of tease out some of these things, right? But it's certainly a brilliant argument. I'll say that.
Yeah, and then we were kind of talking about like control and stuff a little bit a while ago when it was coming to like the guards and magistrates and policemen. So one thing that struck me in here was he talks about in if you have someone who's lazy, he say, friend, we should like to work with you, but as you are often absent from your post and you do your work negligently, you must part. Go and find other comrades who will put up with your indifference. So what they're saying is if you did run across people who were not holding up their fair share, you could sort of run them out. Now, it's not clear to me in the book under what authority or what force you would be using to make that person depart. Is it merely that they would be sort of shunned from the group? Is it a social constraint, or all of a sudden you're saying, well, over there, so and so, he's a lazy one, and then because your society would be all based on this, that would probably be, I guess you wouldn't really have crimes in this kind of society, but that would be held up as, I don't know what the word would, but it's sort of a norm or something that person has broken what we consider a norm, and so now they would be on the bottom rung or be expelled or whatever. But it's not clear to me what the practical procedure would be for doing that.
Yeah, I would say he definitely does get a little bit fuzzy here when he's talking how you would expel people who are lazy. Which I mean, he'd say, for instance, he does say that essentially, here he says, quote, somebody has said that dust is merely matter who has settled in the wrong place. The same definition applies for 9/10 of those called. So he does seem to think that the majority of supposedly lazy people, and he uses examples such as Darwin, which is a famous example. He was very lazy in school, did terrible, absolutely terrible in school. Yeah, he just ignored his studies, didn't do anything, but he would read in his spare time, very interested in things, but he never attended classes and just basically nearly failed and everything like that. But then you found something that interested him, and he produced one of the greatest of science, right? Which no doubt required a certain level of intellect. And he uses other examples of this. But he does seem to think that, like, at the end of the day, probably will be a few lazy people, and you've just got to expel them. And again, it does get a little bit fuzzy here, it would seem to me at least. Maybe he's going to clarify it. We still have a little bit of book to go. But it does seem to be a little bit fuzzy. It seems to be somewhat analogous, as I'm reading it, as to sort of exile we might have heard in previous. So, for instance, Aristotle getting exiled, or what was Julius? Was Julius Caesar exiled? No, it wasn't Julius Caesar. He proposed a number of people to get exiled. Anyway, exile was a very, very famous punishment, and Roman citizens were also granted the possibility of exile over, I believe, execution if they to be executed. And so in any case, that's a very common form of punishment in ancient societies. But this seems to be somewhat analogous, because he does seem to think that there's basically communes which are interested in specific things or specific groups. And so you could basically just kick them out. And then look, if no commune accepts you, well, then you're gonna have to start one, right?
Right.
And so that seems to be just his general approach. I wonder, though, how this would map onto a contemporary society where the state is so reformulated our mothing that we don't really live in isolated, separated communities anymore, right? I mean, it was even just a few hundred, like 130 years ago when Kropotkin was writing, it was a little bit more like you had this city, you had that village, and they were separated. Today, there's a lot of subs in it, and it seems like in a lot of places, everything's very deeply interconnected in a way that might not be today. So I do wonder how this sort of mechanism which Kropotkin seems to think would sort of work, would play out in a modern society, or even really just play out, I should say, contemporary society, or even just out in a modern society. Kropotkin is taught out. So maybe he's going to find that later, but yeah, that's a question that I for sure.
Yeah. So, and I'm getting a couple comments here. It sounds like it's definitely your audio is glitchy. Is it possible you have a cable not pushed in all the way? I don't know, but we're definitely having some glitchy audio stuff here.
I can try to move my mic a little bit closer, or my second mic a little bit closer, but
okay, we can give that a try. Okay, yeah, we'll try to make it work. I might have to have you send me the audio from your end if your end's working, because mine's definitely rough.
Yeah, I can do that.
Yeah. So sorry to sidetrack us here. So where were we? We were talking about where did you leave off, Peyton?
Oh yeah, just leaving off about the possibility of exile from the communities.
Oh right. So that's that's the question, is what exactly would you do, and who would be acceptable to exile? I mean, if you have no rules, we kind of mentioned this earlier, right. If you have no rules, then you could have groups exiling people for what we would consider horrible reasons, right? Based on race and culture and, all sorts of stuff, to say you're not welcome here. Or if somebody, if we had there was a good question about what if there was, a person who had special needs, and then as a community, if you decided, well, this person's not going to be able to produce far more than they can consume, how do you approach that kind of stuff? So I think it definitely gets into a messy area when we start talking about expelling people from a group and doing it in a way that is ethical.
Right, and which seems to be, according to Kropotkin, on the basis of kind of laziness. I mean, right. How do you distinguish laziness from someone who's struggling, or someone who, I mean, we were talking about it before we started recording. My sister has special needs, and any society which exclude my sister is going to exclude me too, right? And there is no way to make that distinction. And this is something that it seems to me that the most vulnerable of societies are the ones which take care of the most vulnerable. And I find the most joy, the most happiness in my life from when I care for my sister. This is caring for others is deeply tied up the finding of well-being. Mm-hmm. To that extent, I don't know that this is something which Kropotkin is directly addressing, and this is a concern that I had earlier in the book as well. I mean, Kropotkin's focus on well-being throughout this book has been focused on individualistic well-being, which is to say, well-being accrued for myself, but how to actually cultivate the caring for other people in a way which isn't just merely mechanistic. I mean, right. We do seem to gain great value caring for other people. That's how we are as a species, as a people, and something that Kropotkin is, at least for me, coming from my perspective, I would need to see Kropotkin address more directly if I would feel comfortable, in a society which Kropotkin specifically is advocating for.
Yeah, and I think it's I think it's interesting because it would be kind of a hard, I don't know. I kind of lost my train of thought there, but it's where was I? It's just difficult. It's just difficult to think of. Yeah, and I've sort of over my lifetime I've kind of made a change where as the point I'm in my life now, I definitely care much more about other people. Like I've kind of learned that over the years. I know when I was younger and really didn't have as much as I even needed, I mean, that was not necessarily my number one concern, was like looking out for other people, making sure others are taken care of. And I would agree with you that as that I, becoming a parent and all sorts of stuff, like you start to, you get that deeper sense of value in helping other people. And you truly start to realize that how valuable that is to help others and bring that help to other people, especially when you know it's a help that they either would have a difficult time bringing to themselves or that they are unable to bring to themselves.
Yeah.
And you can provide that to someone and you can lift them up. And sometimes it doesn't even cost you that much, right? As far as either physical effort or something, but you can really change someone else with their day with a minimal effort. And I think that's one of the things I like about Kropotkin's vision here, is that if everyone was looking out for everyone else, I think there's a lot that we could create. I mean, I think there's it wouldn't really be a question of shortage. It would be a question of how much, I think you could easily create plenty, because right now we're all running around trying to do as little as possible and each get our cut of the share, and you do just enough to create that. But if it really was a sense of, well, this work that I do right now is really going to help the whole community, I think there would be a power to that a lot of people would recognize, right? So,
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, were you going to say something?
Well, I was just going to say I have a comment here. So it's kind of off topic about communism and anarchism. How can people live without rules? Which is a huge topic. I mean, that's kind of I don't know that there's a quick answer for that. That's a lot of what the whole book is about. But you're looking, it's not a quick answer. We're looking at lots of little ways that sort of contribute to that overall idea, right?
Yeah, and to some extent, Kropotkin's response here with, the lazy objection that he's answering in this particular chapter is also a response to that concern over rules. Now, I want to go back to what you're saying there. Something I found is that actually by caring for other people, you learn to care for them. In other words, just by performing the act towards the individual, you find yourself coming closer to that person and wanting to care for them more. And I think that that's something which, needs to be cultivated in our life. Of course, the concern is always that can go too far in that direction, and you can end a situation where you're not actually ever caring for yourself, because obviously self-care is very, very important, right? Like if you, are constantly trying to help other people and you never take time to really reflect on yourself and just do something for you, you can ultimately have that burnout, and then can become resentful of that you're giving other people, and that's never a good situation which you want to be in. It is about I think sitting. I mean, I don't want too cheesy here, but sort of situating your heart in a right way, finding the routines in your life which can allow your heart to be situated in a right way, the way that you can take pleasure in good. Because oftentimes we don't merely want to do good. We don't just want to give money to to a homeless person. We want to also take pleasure in doing that good, and
right.
Bring those two things together is really important, such that the actions of a good thing is not merely doing some duty, following deontological principle of like I'm going to good thing here. It's also about cultivating a sort of a virtue as well, and cultivating happiness in doing good.
Which is one thing that I think we sort of do the opposite of in modern day society, right? I feel like our modern day culture is very individualistic, right? It's very much about the individual. And even a lot of the propaganda you hear when discussing these is, what about the freedoms of the individual? And what about, all these kind of things, when you realize what we would get is a much more communal system. You would know people. Right. I mean, right now in most neighborhoods, you don't even really know your neighbors, the people that you live next to, all for years and years and years. And now people barely know the people that they live around and stuff. And we're just, especially now with, I'm taking us off track, but social media and everything, it's like we just don't actually know the humans around us. We know the humans we used to know, and we connect to them through Facebook or whatever, but the actual humans in your neighborhood, maybe you don't know them so well. And it makes a lot of these ideas in this book, I think, a little harder to grasp at, because it's so foreign to how we do things today.
Right. And again, I think that, being able to find happiness in doing good, like bring together happiness and the good, that's what I think you really fish at. When you can learn to take pleasure and be happy at providing for other people. As you find, you care for people with special needs, or you care for people who sick or elderly, like, finding being able to find pleasure in that thing which know of as good is, it seems to me, like the fulfillment of human life. But again, you do have to strike balance. It can't just be mandatory. It can't just constantly be like, oh, I have to do that, because
Right.
then you're going to go that resentment for caring for other people. You have to be able to take steps back and take time self-care. And it is about striking that balance. But if you go too far on the individualist side of things, you do miss out those opportunities which you were just referring to, or miss out on those opportunities to help other people and find happiness in helping other people, which again seems to me bringing together the happy and the duty angle, where it's not just a question of that you can really find fulfillment in life. Now, I want to move through this book a little bit. You had concerns about, I don't know if they were concerns, comments, because he talks about teaching and things like that, and obviously that's sort of up your alley a little bit. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, so I think he actually has a point here where he talks about the education system and the education system itself sort of knocking the sort of introducing the laziness into people through our education system. And I think that I would agree with that. I mean, as someone, I didn't, when I was younger, we moved a lot when I was younger. I had, when I was in my early 20s, I had more addresses than I had years on the planet. So we moved a lot. And there were times where I went to schools which were not great. Right. There were times I went to okay schools, but there were times where I was in schools that were definitely subpar. And it was a different reality. You didn't want to, there was no reason to be excellent, to, even if you were interested in something, the teachers were sort of taking any kind of interest or anything out of it. And as a professor myself, and my wife's a teacher, I sort of have some insight into this. I would say, part of that is, when we're in the classroom, we don't get free reign. We're told by the state or whatever what it is we're supposed to be teaching in the classroom. So we're already kind of handcuffed anyways. And then on top of that, you have teachers who can make things interesting and teachers who don't. But I would say there are definitely settings where that educational system can steal that interest of people. And, if someone's interested in something, you can ruin that subject for them pretty quickly by teaching it the wrong way. So he talks about, sort of, and you had alluded to his educational earlier, but he talks to ways in which you can make it more interesting, which is a lot of what's actually going on in society right now, or in education, I should say right now, where there's a movement to go back and make it less rote and less just learn all these different factoring techniques and then take the test. It's more about trying to see the big picture and how do you put all these things together in a way that not only can you use in your life, but hopefully will give you some tools to think about things when you're doing stuff. And that's hard to do. I mean, that's one reason why really great teachers are absolutely fantastic, is because it is like an art form when you can do this really well, because and there's lots of things that go into it, right? Students coming from different households, and they're all bringing their different baggage to the classroom and stuff. But teaching done well, I would say, can definitely steal that motivation from students, and it can squash that. If there's a bit of a spark in them, you can easily put that spark out if you're not careful with the way they're being educated. There's a big picture. Education's influenced by so many things that it's hard to talk about. But when I read what he was saying, I could say there are definitely parts of education where I would agree with what you're saying, including as a math professor. I would say there are some of the ways that mathematics is taught. I get why everyone hates mathematics. I hated mathematics until I got to the other side of calculus, because of the way that it's taught. It just makes you're like, okay, I'm just going to memorize this stuff and reproduce it. There's not that interest. And that's what he's talking about, is take someone out, show them natural sciences out in the world, and get them interested in things, show them how to build things with their hands rather than just being in a book all day long. And he uses the examples of studying dead languages Which, a dead language can be very interesting to some people, but if you're not a person who wants to study a dead language, that's the kind of thing that could make a person not want to go to school and go, why am I doing this?
Yeah, I hated it when I studied it for quite a while until we started reading actual text. Like we started reading Ovid's Metamorphoses, started reading Augustine like in the original Latin, and then I suddenly had an incentive to it very quickly. This is very fascinating. The different things that you could take out of a text when you understand its original language, and you understand that sort of grammatical angle can be quite interesting. And it is very, very difficult, like especially in the case of foreign language, to be able to give the big picture while simultaneously reading the small parts of it. It can be really, really difficult. And I imagine in the case of mathematics as well, perhaps especially, and it's not even clear, I should say to all mathematicians, like what mathematics like really is, like in the abstract, if you could then have some sort of over our definition. So I mean these like really difficult questions, and which are really difficult to speak on. I mean, I've definitely experienced that, Chris, where you take a test on something and you just had to study and cram it all in your brain, and just you never, even if it's a subject you love, you don't want to think about it again the next 3 months. You're you're done with it the next 3 months. Even if you love the subject, it just completely shut off your brain because the way it was taught, or the way that the tests were, and the sort of force rigor of it can really sort of swap from you. So yeah, absolutely. I definitely empathize with a lot of what Kropotkin was saying here about schooling, and how you need to make in such a way that can provide a spark for people, so they're not perceived as lazy. That like when we think about laziness, we can't just think look at the results. You also need to look at the whole system in question. Okay, well, whenever you see someone lazy, you shouldn't just jump to the conclusion, oh, that person is lazy. You also need to start asking other questions about the person's nutrition, the person's upbringing, the person's well-being in that respect. What are the teachers involved? What's that person's particular emotional sort of balance, and how does that relate to things? And Kropotkin seems to hear, and even says so much, that in sort of his society, we would actually need to think about society in that way. You need to think about laziness in that way, so then we don't just kick everybody out for being lazy. Like you would need to find the best ways to maximize organization. Again, going back to that Dust quote, where it says somebody said that dust is merely matter gone into the wrong place. The same definition as to 9/10 of those who are called lazy. So he seems to think that an anarchist society would have a sort of built-in mechanism, because they don't want to just exile everybody. They don't want to just expel everybody, to make sure that everybody into the right place. I don't know about that, if I'm being honest. I would like to leave it, but some of the things that I see from people, and maybe this is just a fact of capitalist society, but there's a lot of people who love retribution, and that's and I'll say we even see it on the left. You'll see whenever somebody that they like got their comeuppance, people retweeting it, having like hearts and stuff around it. And I'll admit it, yeah, sometimes I watch it and I like it, it sort of riles a little bit. It's easy to get caught up in that, but Kropotkin seems to think here in this chapter, and he's even alluded to this a little bit in the past, for instance, when he said that if we had an anarchist society, would have to include the bourgeois. We can't just, we use the guillotine, right? We need to find a way to bring them in,
right?
In which they like this new society. Otherwise, you won't ever achieve it. Kropotkin seems to think that we need to be able to put aside those I don't want to use the reptilian, because then we get conspiracy theories, but these sort of animalistic attitudes of ourselves towards retribution. We need to find ways to really move beyond those sentiments. And I worry that maybe that's asking too much of people. Maybe it's not, but it sounds hard. It sounds very, very difficult.
I almost think that's the part that we could deal with if you had people, because I've kind of made that change, right? As I've aged and I've gone through life, I feel more like I look at the prison system now and I realize this shouldn't be about retribution. It should be about helping people become members of society again, so that they don't have that need to commit crimes or whatever it is that occurred. So you want to get away from retribution, I think that would come with society. I think it would go along with this thing of people sort of coming together as a community and realizing when I go to work, yeah, I could get away with not going to work today, but if I did that for very long, the society would kind of fall apart. So I kind of would hope, maybe I'm being too optimistic, that part would kind of come along with the cultural change. The thing that I would call him out on that I don't know that I agree with is this idea that you could peacefully introduce the bourgeois into society, because I don't in any way condone violence, but you just want, I mean, is Jeff Bezos just going to like give it all up so he can go work 4 hours a week in a factory 4 hours, 5 times a week? Is Jeff Bezos going to do that? I mean, I just sort of don't really see how that would happen. So, I mean, I would hope that it could. My hope is that as we move forward in society and make positive changes, we do it through democracy, we do it through people working together, we do it through positive means. And I certainly am not calling for revolution or violence in any way. I just wonder how you would get the people on board. I mean, that's that mentality you live if you're in that top 1%, is that you're special and you get to live this godlike life. I mean, why would you give up the godlike life if you didn't have to, right? To go be like a mere mortal. Who's going to do that? And so asking them to do it voluntarily, I mean, I don't know. What'd you say?
I said Jesus, right? Who's going to give up the godlike life? I mean, it sounds right, but that's the point. Like, it sounds a little bit difficult to. It sounds really, really, really hard. Right. I'm happy to hear optimism that we could get people to move forward and abandon those retribution, sort of retribution and the like.
I think some of these ideas are kind of like ingrained. Like, I think capitalism itself, we don't really teach capitalism. I think we indoctrinate capitalism, right? And I think this retribution is something we learn retribution as a natural thing, right? We feel good when someone who hurts kids gets what they have coming, right? And you sort of feel like justice was served. But sometimes you kind of learn to fight that a little bit and say, well, how can we just make the situation better, right? And no one wants to ever see anyone hurt kids or whatever, and people should pay consequences for those acts. But the ultimate goal should be, how do we put society right so this kind of thing doesn't happen again, and we don't have this person repeat offending, and what can we do to sort of help people? It's a different point of view, but sometimes people have to be shown that point of view because it's not the immediate thing that they think of.
Yeah, and it's really, really, really difficult to cultivate those sorts of virtues. It's like this is the kind of thing society would need to expend a lot of resources in, making it so that people grow up this way. And Kropotkin would think that that's ultimately going to be the only way that we move forward, that we stop viewing lazy people or people who do bad things as immediately it's there. We have to think about how society can reshift things so that they're not just floating around in the wrong place, that they're not just, as he says again, matter in the wrong place. It's difficult. It's for sure tough. It's some stuff. It's some stuff. Any other main things that you go over in this?
I think
we've mostly hit through all of chapter 12 there.
Yeah, I think we hit that chapter 12. So just to comment on a comment here in the comments here in the chat. So it's Public Citizen is saying capitalism is the natural order of humanity in one form or another. It's not indoctrination, it's nature. You can't fight Mother Nature. Yeah, so that's actually that's a point that's held up by quite a few people. That's one of the things that regularly gets held against this kind of book and this kind of thinking, and it definitely is addressed in earlier chapters. So I'm just kind of putting that out there so people could take a look if they want. Yeah. I don't remember what part of the book, but there is. Go ahead, Peyton.
I was going to say, so Kropotkin's main analysis, I hope my audio isn't too terrible still. Kropotkin's main analysis is like a kind of biological one, right? Like he's taking the work of Darwin and trying to sort of, in a sense, turn it on its head in a sociological interpretation. I mean, there was a lot of Darwinians early on that took it to mean that this society when minimized is one which everybody's fighting against one another. Kropotkin says actually we should reshift and think about progressive evolution as a question of how species responds to its environment. and sort of retilting that angle. So Kropotkin's entire book is a response to that. So certainly, I would recommend kind of going through this book. You might not agree, right? You might ultimately. I'm definitely more so on left, and you can tell by some of the concerns that I've raised. I'm not sure that I completely buy all the arguments that he's giving. I think that onto some things. That's my take, but there are some parts where I'm sort of like, I don't know if that's how it would play out. So look at the book itself for yourself, right, and really think through these objections. Is my view on it. I wouldn't ever really jump to the conclusion that something is natural. It's there's a lot of things that people have said are natural. People said church was natural, that the hierarchy of the church was like all these things in the past. People always seem to say, well, this is natural, that's natural. Seems like any society, any culture says that their organization system is natural, that the divine writings, this is natural. I think anytime you evoke a question of saying, oh, well, the natural, it's the only way this could ever be, I think that it might be true, right? Like maybe we found the best and only way that society could run and be organized. But I think that there are just so many different options out there that you should be inherently skeptical of that position. That's my opinion. Maybe you disagree, but sort of my take on that. Like you should put an extra level of skepticism whenever you assume that something is natural.
Yeah. And I should clarify, I'm not necessarily saying that you can't have a valid view towards capitalism. Like that is definitely possible that someone can say, well, I prefer capitalism for these reasons. The reason I'm calling it indoctrination is because I feel like it's just sort of taken without, like in this country, when you grow up, it's just sort of taken as capitalism is the only way that can exist. And as soon as you bring up these other ways, and you certainly weren't doing this in the chat, but as soon as you bring up other possibilities, people are immediately jumping on it to it's almost like it's just been ingrained in there. They can't, many people can't listen to these ideas. Like this book would, some people would just think it was complete rubbish. They aren't even open to those ideas. And I think that happens pretty early for a lot of people. I do acknowledge that you can have a valid view that capitalism is the right one. So I'm not invalidating that point of view.
Well,
and I think, and just let me add. So I think his other book that's really famous, Mutual Aid, I haven't read it yet, but I have watched a couple of videos summarizing it. And I believe in that book, he looks at a lot of natural situations and because, the argument can be made, well, capitalism, if you look at the prey and predator model, then it's the person going out and taking what they can get, sort of somewhat is like capitalism. But Kropotkin, I believe, goes through and makes numerous cases where cooperation is natural in animals. So ants, right? You can never have a single ant. An ant colonies only exist when they are cooperating together, when they are working together for the good of everyone, right? So I believe that's a lot of what he talks about in Mutual Aid, is taking, or at least he addresses, is looking at nature and saying how this community and working together, I think that's his point, is it is in fact a natural way of doing things.
And I'll just add one other point to this question of capitalism being natural. Which one? Which capitalism? Every single country has a different form of capitalism. So in Germany, workers are given, and the environmentalist and local communities are given a nearly 50% stake in on the boards of large corporations. In France, workers also have certain rights. Are different than the rights that are in the United States. So a single country has a different form of capitalism. Oftentimes they vary quite substantially.
Yeah.
So if you're going to say that capitalism is natural, I hear that, and that's like, it's a reasonable thing to think. Again, there's, possibly thousands, have been throughout history, thousands of other ways of organizing society. But then even now, you're okay. Capital is natural. Well, which form of capitalism is natural? Because all these other forms seem to still exist. And so, I think that just bare like you should probably, it seems to me at least that that something is natural is like very strong claim, like an incredibly strong claim that's really difficult, not only just to prove, but just very difficult to even know for sure that anything is ever really natural. I suppose you could maybe say breathing is natural, but like, what do you even mean when you say breathing is natural? It's not clear what that really entail. So I don't know. In any case, is that about it for chapter 12?
I think that's about it for 12. Yeah.
Awesome. So next time around, what do you want to look at? You want to look at chapter 13. It's about maybe the same list as this one. Let's see how many pages. 14
yeah, I kind of looked at it. I think we maybe go one chapter next time.
Okay, just chapter 13. Okay, all right, awesome. So next time around, we'll be looking at chapter 13, the collectivist wages system. So it'll be more so responding to the objection state communism, or the concern of state communism, and saying that there's problems there, being that Kropotkin is an anarchist, and he has had a lot of interesting criticisms of Marx, which I find more compelling than some of the criticisms which capitalists level on Marx. So I'm looking forward to chapter 13. So if you all are interested in that, hit the follow button either for Chris or I, and yeah, we'll be here back again next week, Wednesday, 7:30 Eastern, 4 Pacific.
Yep, and thanks, Public Citizen. Hope you're here next time. Great comments, really helped the conversation. So hope you're back next time. Give a follow, hopefully, and then you can meet us back here next Wednesday. So yeah, we'll be looking at that next chapter next time, and we'll get that sound issues figured out, and we'll get that taken care of, and then yeah, so we'll see everybody next time, and thanks for joining us for the Bread Book Club. And just to be clear, for anyone who came in late, it's The Conquest of Bread by Peter Kropotkin that we were looking at, for anyone who came in late there. Okay, yep, yeah, we got Conquest of Bread. All right, thanks, everybody. We'll see you later.
Thanks.